Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 14.4A. I've entitled this video, The Pyramid of Power. This video is going to cover pages 391 to 394. Southern agriculture. Slavery was at the heart of the Southern economy. But that did not mean that every white person owned large numbers of enslaved people. White society in the South was complex and had many levels. Most white Southerners fit into one of four categories: yeoman, tenant farmer, rural poor, or plantation owner. And as you can see over here, this pie graph, you can see that nearly half of the people in the South were whites who had no slaves at all. So nearly half of the South were white people who didn't have any slaves at all. And then you can see the other breakdown. About 34% of the South were African Americans. Of those, 2% of the population in the South were free African Americans, 32% were enslaved African Americans, and only about 17%, less than 1 in 5, were actually slave-holding whites. Question number 1. What was the heart of the Southern economy at that time? Slavery. Question 2. What were the four social categories of the whites living in the South at that time? You had the yeoman, tenant farmer, rural poor, and plantation owners. Small farmers and the rural poor. Most white people in the South were yeomen, farmers who generally owned small farms of 50 to 200 acres. These yeomen lived mostly in the upper South and in the hilly areas of the deep South. They did not practice plantation-style agriculture. They grew crops to use themselves and to trade with local merchants. Yeomen generally owned few or no enslaved African Americans. Another group of Southern whites worked as tenant farmers. They rented land from property owners, so they were not as well off as the yeomen. These classes of white Southerners made up the majority of the white population of the South. They lived in simple homes, cottages, or log cabins. The poorest of these groups lived in crude cabins. These rural poor were often stubborn and independent. Though they were looked down upon by many, they were proud of their ability to provide for their families. In some cases, we would call these people hillbillies because many of them were named William or Bill, and they lived in the hills, so hillbilly. And when you think about the stereotype of a hillbilly, you think of that stubborn and independent person who was looked down upon by many, but they were proud of who they were. A few free African Americans also held enslaved workers. Some free African Americans bought members of their own families to free them, although others worked their enslaved workers in the same manner as white Southern planters. Now we can do question 3. Who were the yeomen? The yeomen were the farmers who generally owned anywhere between 50 to 200 acres, so they actually were decently well off. Now they mostly lived in the upper South or in the hilly areas of the deep South. They didn't have plantation agriculture. They grew crops, but not in a plantation style. And generally they owned no slaves or a few, but that's all. Question 4. Who were the tenant farmers? The tenant farmers were on the pyramid of power. They were below the yeoman because they did not have as much money, so they would rent land from property owners. So they were basically just renting land and working that, and then hopefully having some of the food to provide for themselves. Number 5, who were the rural poor? Well, these people were even further down in the pyramid of power. They didn't have a lot, thus rural poor, but they were stubborn and independent, and many times we think of them as the hillbillies of that area. Plantation owners. The larger plantations covered several thousand acres. In addition to the land they owned, plantation owners measured their wealth by the number of enslaved people they had. In 1860, only about 4% of slaveholders held 20 or more enslaved workers. Earning profit was the main goal for owners of large plantations. To make a profit, they needed to bring in more money than they spent to run their plantations. Large plantations had fixed costs. These are operating costs that remain much the same year after year. For example, the cost of housing and feeding workers is a fixed cost. There is no easy way to reduce a fixed cost. On the other hand, the price of cotton changed from season to season. A change in price often meant the difference between a successful year for a plantation and a bad one. Question number 6. What were the two ways that plantation owners measured the wealth they had? By the amount of land they had, or acreage of land they had, and also by the number of enslaved people that they owned. Question number 7. By 1860, what percentage of slaveholders held 20 or more slaves? Only 4%. So a vast majority of the South were not plantation owners as far as like having a large quantity of enslaved persons. Question number 8. What was the main goal of the plantation owners and how did they try to achieve that goal? Well, the main goal for plantation owners, of course, was to make a profit. In order to make a profit, you've got to bring in more money than you spend. And that's just basic economics. But that was challenging for them because of the difference between the fixed cost and the price of cotton. And that leads us to the next question, question 9. What were the fixed costs for the plantation owners? Fixed costs were the costs that you have year after year. It doesn't change. For example, housing and feeding the people that work for you is a fixed cost. Question 10. Why was the price of cotton a challenge for southern plantation owners? Because that was not a fixed cost. Sometimes the price of cotton was high, sometimes the price of cotton was low. And so from year to year, the plantation owners didn't know were they going to have a great year or a bad one. Plantation owners, who were almost always men, traveled often in order to ensure fair dealings with traders. Their wives often led difficult and lonely lives. They took charge of their households and supervised the buildings. They watched over the enslaved domestic workers and sometimes tended to them when they became ill. Women also often kept the plantation's financial records. Keeping a plantation running involved many tasks. Some enslaved people cleaned the house, cooked, did laundry and sewing, and served meals. Others were trained as blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, or weavers. Still, others tended livestock. Most enslaved African Americans, however, were field hands. They worked from sunrise to sunset to plant, tend, and harvest crops. An overseer, or plantation manager, supervised them. Question number 11. Why did the plantation owners travel often? Well, they were traveling to try to get fair deals with the people they were trading. They were trying to get good cotton prices, and they were trying to make sure that the people that were buying the cotton lived up to their end of the bargain. Question 12. What tasks did the wives of plantation owners have to do? Well, they had to take care of the household and supervise the buildings. They watched over the workers, and sometimes they did tend to them when they became ill, and sometimes the women kept the financial records of the plantation. Question 13. What role did the overseer have on the plantations? The overseer was a much hated person because they were the person supervising the slaves. They weren't the plantation owner. And as you can see, the characteristic of an overseer was the whip that you see in this picture here, or sometimes the paddle. They were the muscle of the plantation. They were the punishers. They were the ones doling out the pain to the enslaved people when the overseer did not like how they were acting. The lives of enslaved people. The fate of most enslaved African Americans was hardship and misery. They worked hard, earned no money, and had little hope of freedom. They lived with the threat that a slaveholder could sell them or members of their family without warning. In the face of these brutal conditions, enslaved African Americans tried to build stability. They kept up their family lives as best as they could. They developed a culture all their own that blended African and American elements. They came up with clever ways to resist slavery. African American family life. The law did not recognize slave marriages. Still, enslaved people did marry and raise families, which provided comfort and support. Uncertainty and danger, however, were always present. There were no laws or customs that would stop a slaveholder from breaking a family apart. If a slaveholder chose to, or if the slaveholder died, families could be, and often were, separated. In the face of this threat, enslaved people set up a network of relatives and friends. If an owner sold a father or mother, an aunt, an uncle, or a close friend stepped in to raise the children left behind. These networks were a source of strength in the lives of enslaved people. Large, close-knit extended families became an important part of African American culture. African American culture. In 1808, Congress banned the import of slaves. Slavery remained legal, but traders could no longer purchase enslaved people from other countries. Some illegal slave trading continued, but by 1860, almost all the enslaved people in the South had been born there. Though most enslaved people were born in the United States, they tried to preserve African customs. They passed traditional African folk stories on to their children. They performed African music and dance. Enslaved people also drew on African rhythms to create musical forms that were uniquely American. One form was the work song or field holler. A worker led a rhythmic call and response song, which sometimes included shouts and moans. The beat set the tempo for the work in the fields. Question number 14. What are 5 reasons or examples why the lives of most African American slaves were full of hardship and misery? Well, number 1, they had to work extremely hard in the hot conditions of the South. Number 2, they weren't earning any money for the work they were doing. Number 3, they had little hope of freedom, very little chance of success as far as like escaping from their horrible lives. Number 4, they constantly had to live with the threat that a slaveholder could sell them at any time. Or, number 5, that they could sell members of their own family without those sorts of warnings. So these were examples of why their lives were extremely challenging. And question 15 is going to be not in the textbook itself, but over a combination of slides that I've added from previous presentations. So looking at house slaves or domestic slaves, most house slaves were living under better conditions than field workers. However, house slaves did not get Sunday off and usually attended church with the master and mistress. House slaves cleaned, cooked, served meals, and took care of the children. Some house slaves lived in attics, closets, or corners in the big house, even if their families lived in the quarters. A cook's day was long and hard. A cook got up early in the morning to cook breakfast, and the day ended with cleaning up after dinner and gathering firewood for the next day. These slaves sometimes stole food from the owner. A house slave had a better opportunity to learn how to read and write. They often listened in on their owner's conversations, so they were able to warn field slaves of the owners auctioning certain slaves and other important things. House slaves did many other things, such as waited on tables, washed, ironed, took up and put down carpets, hauled the large steaming pots for the preservation of fruits, lifted the barrels with cucumbers soaking in brine, opened up the barrels of flour, swept floors, dusted furniture, hoed and weeded gardens, and collected the chicken eggs. They also took care of the infants, allowing the mistress to do whatever she wanted. These slaves also weaved, quilted, and spun lines. Although house slaves had more privileges, being a house slave was not much, if any, easier than being a field worker. And now the field slaves. A field slave worked from sunrise to sunset. During harvest, they would work an 18-hour day. Women field slaves worked the same as men. Pregnant women were expected to work until the child was born. After birth, the woman worked in the field with the child on her back. At the end of the workday, the slave would have his or her cotton weighed. The minimum amount of cotton to be picked in one day was 200 pounds. Failure to get to that number would result in punishment. So finally, question 15. What were some of the differences between the house slaves and the field slaves? Well, as you could see, the house slaves did more of the work inside. They had a better opportunity to learn how to read and write. They also had an opportunity to eavesdrop on the doings of the plantation, and sometimes they might get information about that the plantation owner was thinking about selling some of the slaves, so they might get that information and be able to pass that along. And they also had to work on Sundays, where the field slaves did not. The field slaves, on the other hand, they had to work from sunrise to sunset during harvest, working those long 18-hour days. They had to pick the cotton, and they had to pick at least 200 pounds. So you could definitely say their work was more physically demanding out in the sun. Between the two, I would definitely want to be a house slave over a field slave, just based on what I've read. Maybe you could come up to your own conclusion on that. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, I didn't want a meme today. I didn't think this material was worth a meme. I didn't want to make light of the material. So instead, I wanted you to actually look at these two pictures and think about, when someone says, oh, slavery wasn't that bad, just think about this imagery here and think about really who's actually saying that. It's never a slave saying it's not that bad. It's always the people that are doing the slavery that are saying, oh, it wasn't that bad. But when you look at these images here, just think about how cruel and unjust this system was. All right, well, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.